The Eyes of My Regret by Angelina Weld Grimke. Always at dusk, the same tearless experience, the same dragging of feet up the same well-worn path to the same well-worn rock, the same crimson or gold dropping away of the sun, the same tints, rose, saffron, violet, lavender, gray meeting, mingling, mixing mistily. Before me, the same blue-black cedar rising jaggedly to a point. Over it, the same slow unlidding of twin stars. Two eyes, unfathomable, soul-searing, watching me, the same two eyes that draw me forth against my will dusk after dusk, the same two eyes that keep me sitting late into the night, chin on knees, keep me there lonely, rigid, tearless, numbly miserable, the eyes of my regret.
John Kruth is a singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist with a deep album catalog. He's also a writer, music journalist who's written about popular music, bios on Roy Orbison, Townes Van Zandt, Rahsaan Roland Kirk, John and Yoko. This show is an interview with John about his new book on Pink Floyd. It's called Lunacy. Enjoy.
What's really strange about these Zoom things is that we often get a close-up of the beard. Okay. So where are you?
I'm in Redlands, California. Well, you were here.
Oh my goodness. I was just there. I was just playing Joshua Tree.
Oh.
And my good friend Victor Krummenacher is from Redlands.
Right.
And there's a studio, I can't remember the name of it, that we play there, and we'll be playing there again sometime soon.
Yeah, that's my studio.
That's your studio.
We took a really fun picture at the end with the crowd.
Yeah, I have a copy of that picture. It's great.
It's a wonder. It's a sort of, that picture sort of says what happened.
Yeah, it was a great night. We need more of them.
Yeah, John Kruth. Yeah. I have a book.
Bright Moments.
Bright Moments.
Right
and
now.
I have this book. And I go, that's got to be the same cat. A new edition,
Yeah.
right?
New edition. There's a second edition. Hold on a second.
Here we go.
Here it is in Japanese.
There you go.
Here it is in French.
Yes, of course.
They really did a beautiful job. They did all these color images in there.
Oh, wow.
They did all the albums. Where is it? All the albums. I was just knocked out. I was like, I love you guys.
Yeah.
Look at that.
The French.
They just really did it right.
They love
and
jazz.
then my latest budget version with the great Joe Shardello cover.
Yeah.
It's really something else.
It's a wonderful cover.
Here are a couple of Beatle books I did.
Right. Rubber Soul.
Rubber Soul and Plastic Ono Band was the most recent one. And Lunacy. I handed in the book on John and Yoko, and my editor said, "So what's next? What are you thinking about?" I said, "I want to write a book about somebody that I played music with, somebody I ate a meal with, somebody I rode in a car with, somebody that I knew. I don't want to write a book about people that I don't know. I said, well, either Ornette Coleman, who I was lucky enough to know for the last 10 years of his life and interviewed many times and get to play music with on occasion, or John Prine, who I did get to play with and travel with a bit and open shows for. He said, well, the Prine estate's going wild right now, putting out everything. So we can't compete with that. And I can't sell a book on Ornette Coleman. He said, I really kind of like the 50th anniversary books you've been doing. I said, oh, so what's next? Dark Side of the Moon? And he was like, yeah. Took a little persuading because I was actually a bigger fan of metal, perhaps I would say.
Yeah.
Of the post-Sid era. Metal was probably my favorite album, but it did, like Revolver, it led to Pepper. There's very often you have these, the greatest album that everybody sees as the greatest album. Quite often it's what came before.
Post Sergeant Pepper, they'll go, there's some really breakthrough sound and songwriting. Just
Sure. Well, you've got some silver hair. You probably remember.
Oh yes, yes. I remember sitting with my cousin, watching Ed Sullivan Show and the Beatles. The
Wow.
first night they played, and she was a
Yeah,
teenager.
sure.
She was a teenager at that
Wow.
time, and so she just like swept me into music.
Yeah. My sister had a very cool boyfriend who turned me on to all kinds of things. Took me to see Allen Ginsberg read and played Mose Allison records for me, and Carlos Castaneda books, and I learned a lot from him. And he had the first mandolin I ever saw and was playing blues harp, and so it was just like, so there it was. It was like my path was kind of laid out for me.
Because I was just thrilled that someone had written a book about, Rassan. Because I said, it was kind of like the Ornette Coleman. I go, well, who's really going to read about Rassan Kirk?
Yeah, Joel Dorn had that mindset. I mean, Rassan was a surrealist in so many ways, and so was Joel, and Joel recognized that in Rassan. There's a lot of Dadaism in the new book. One of the things that is really interesting about this book, Lunacy, is that I was just not interested in retelling the same story over and over again and, regaling a certain time period and all of that. So, my friend Cork Marquesky, who had a band called the 50-Foot Hose back in the day in San Francisco, arguably the first electronic rock band, he was my college teacher at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design, and he played bass and theremin and was really into electronic sound and all of this stuff. And his art is the background on the book cover. When you see the book cover, those are not like just colored lights or something. It's part of a sculpture that he made. And we started talking about Dadaism and comparing Cafe Voltaire to the UFO or the UFO club in London in 1966 that Joe Boyd ran, where Pink Floyd and everybody from the Incredible String Band, the Soft Machine, and Fairport Convention all played this place.
Right.
And things were really getting pretty wild there with Mr. Sid Barrett. And I guess I was really lucky enough to the interviews that I did for the book were with not the typical kind of people that you expect at all. Marique from The Fool, who painted Apple Boutique and did the clothes for Wonderwall, the movie, and painted George Harrison's Mini Cooper, and did album covers for the Incredible String Band and all that. She was fantastic to talk to because she just brought you right there, as Pete Brown did, the lyricist for most of Jack Bruce's great songs like White Room and Dance the Night Away.
Oh,
And he was friends with Sid Barrett, so he could he lived in a house with Syd Barrett and could tell me what was happening on a, on a real day-to-day kind of level. And he was absolutely adamant that LSD destroyed the cultural revolution of the 1960s. That was what led to, of course, Syd's downfall. So it was just such a great ride. I have such an interesting batch of people in this book. I had talked to Hal Wilner about that album in the past. Even Arif Mardin is in the book, who was a producer and arranger for Atlantic Records, and Robin Williamson of the Incredible String Band. I had actually talked to Richie Havens at
Wow.
one point about some of the songs from Dark Side of the Moon. And I was just not going to write a typical book, another book. Who needs another book on Pink Floyd?
So what I'm looking forward to in Lunacy is that it's that entry point. It's like you say, you didn't want to do a conventional book about Dark Side of the Moon because it's over discussed and over everything, but but you found a pathway through that club and maybe through Sid, or did you get that piece?
And so many of the people that I interviewed, it really had a lot to do with, like, everybody's like, oh, did you talk to David Gilmore? I'm like, no. Did you talk to Nick Mason? No. It's like Rick Wright's the hero of the book, number one. Rick Wright is the hero of the book, because to hear people talk about Rick as a person and his interest in music and what he brought to the music. Les McCann.
Wow.
Les McCann, who was one of the very first guys, was probably the first guy to use synthesizer in jazz on his album Layers, which is a gorgeous album if you've never heard it. He's using the ARP synthesizer. And when you're given a new instrument like that, it's like when Herbie Hancock talked about playing with Miles Davis, and there's no piano in the studio, and he sees this, what he calls a toy piano, right?
Electric piano.
And he's over there and he's hammering a Wurlitzer, and he's like, this thing's a toy, he's like, well, play it. And the book starts off 1971. I'm in my cousin Debbie's bedroom. It's Thanksgiving. Every Thanksgiving, man, cousin Debbie hit me to something fresh and new, whether it was Andre Segovia, the Incredible String Band, Tim Buckley, whatever it was, electronic sounds, Sabatnik. She was a classical guitarist who was deep into music and very cool. And so I was up in cousin Debbie's room, listening to metal, listening to Echoes. And knock, knock, it's Uncle Bobby, the nuclear physicist who splits atoms at the local cyclotron, who's a total egghead, doesn't know the first thing about music, stands there and goes, we used to make sounds like that on the submarine during World War II at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. And he's referring to, of course, the sonar ping, which starts off the piano note that starts off Echoes. And I'm like, it took me a while to realize, wow, my Uncle Bobby was like a pioneer in electronic sound. This album, it had to have been, I mean, when these records started being made with Sgt. Pepper, which just was like, program music. It flowed from one thing into the next.
Right.
It was following the great FM radio that we were hearing. Dark Side of the Moon was like listening to 15 minutes in a row of great FM radios and some of these people were doing stuff like playing King Crimson and then reading a Sylvia Plath poem.
There you go.
So I do a whole chapter on the history of the concept album, starting with Woody Guthrie in 1940, and going from Woody Guthrie to Luke the Drifter by Hank Williams
Right.
to In the Wee Small Hours. So I know there are going to be people that are going to be, what the hell is this guy writing about Hank Williams and Frank Sinatra in a book on? But it's so that you understand the context of everything that leads up to Dark Side of the Moon, whether it's electronic sound, whether it's the blues scene that was happening in England at the time. That's one of the things I just love about the British invasion. And I love about that generation of guys and everything, their devotion to this music. I mean, I thought the blues was British when I was a kid. I
Sure.
didn't know.
Right.
My friend's brother walks in when we're listening to Let It Bleed, and he goes, "What are you listening to that for?" We're going, what should we be listening to?
Right.
And he goes and he gets a picture, gets an album, a Howlin' Wolf, and he puts the wolf on, and it was like, man, it was like getting stung on the nose by a hornet.
You know, in these early club experiences, it seemed like all those musicians are open to so many possibilities, and
Yeah.
that gets infused into a very commercial album. Ultimately, it has some of the soul again of the
Yeah.
times
Oh
because
yeah.
they were listeners.
Well, that's it. Okay, so this is something that will never cease for me. And that is, there was a moment where Miles Davis is playing with his band and he grimaces at the band and he goes like this. He puts his finger to his ear and he's telling them, listen, the music is alive. It's a living, breathing entity. It only became wrapped in plastic and sold as a commodity in recent years. It's always been. And that's kind of one of the things that was really beautiful about Dark Side of the Moon is that this was the first time they shaped an album live because they played it live for almost a year before they recorded it. They weren't selling records like that
No,
before Dark Side of the Moon.
not even close.
Dark Side of the Moon was make it or break it, man. Some of the early records, really hard to find. I remember that this weird kid on the block, he was the weird kid for sure. He had Piper at the Gates of Dawn.
Whoa.
And I just remember holding it and looking at it and looking at those guys in the kaleidoscope shot and thinking, this is really weird. I mean, like the Stones and the Beatles all wore wild clothes by that point. There was something really weird about them. And then you hear Interstellar Overdrive, and it's like, oh my God. It was just like, I was brought up around, my sister had jazz records. She had this boyfriend. I had heard jazz. I had heard Charles Lloyd and Yusef Lateef and Roland Kirk and Miles Davis and all that stuff. So I kind of understood what improvised music was and everything like that. But there was something. And then you hear songs like Bike and Gnome, and you're like, what is going on here? And then
Yeah.
you realize this is perfect soundtrack for reading The Hobbit too.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
Right? It was like hand in hand with The Hobbit. So, and you can understand why Roger Waters had had enough of being in Hobbitville. You can understand why he wanted to make that break. Now, one of the things that's really interesting for me about doing this book was I found out that he was really influenced by Plastic Ono Band, by John singing the truth, the hard truths,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so he started to make a list of all these things that he wanted to sing about and what he thought that the band should, like, confront and talk about. And many of those issues are in the lyrics of Dark Side of the Moon. Eclipse was the great Pink Floyd Kumbaya moment. It's all inclusive. It's almost like, uh, we'll meet again. Don't know why. Don't know. No. Don't know where. Don't know when.
Yeah.
It's almost sonically to me. It's up there with Beethoven's Ninth the ode to joy in a way. I think that that will be a classic piece of music for all time because it's all inclusive. It's universal. It's a universal symbol.
Yeah.
This album is a universal symbol that goes beyond culture, politics, what have you, religion. Nobody really imagined that this record would be on a cassette deck in, like, New Delhi or Rio at the same time. Nobody had any idea that, you would be in Los Angeles, New Delhi, Rio, Johannesburg. Cab drivers in every city on earth were listening to Dark Side of the Moon.
I think this experience is probably going to be a little bit like your book, shining that light. I think that's what I was getting at, is that you may have written books about subjects where the subject would actually like to read about it. Ringo doesn't.
You said it, brother. You just said it. Because somebody told me somebody knew somebody whose daughter was friends with David Gilmore. And I was like, the greatest thing that could happen with this book is that David Gilmore would sit down and read this book and go, wow, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Us. And them. And after all, we're only ordinary men. Me and you.
into the darkness.
Jennifer over there made some arcane request to potentially re-release this record, which I don't think I can afford to do. But I did listen to it for the first time in about 15 years, and I actually was like, it's a good record.
You don't sit around listening to your records?
No, that's a prescription for alcoholism,
Madness?
About you, but no sense of peace that I've ever found has really ever stopped all my worrying. Stop me thinking